The psalmist is really writing about that here. How long, O Lord? I was just wondering when the sun would rise and when I could find the door and when I could get out of the tomb that I was stuck in. But there's things that are much more significant than that. And that's why I titled the sermon, Enlighten My Eyes, because in the middle of this psalm, there's a little phrase in there which is seeking to strive for that hope. So there's really 3 sections in here. And they break out 2 verses apiece. The first 2 verses really are questions that are posed to God. So there's this questioning stage. And then in verses 3 and 4, there's a requesting stage where a petition is made to God for him to act and intervene. And then it changes one more time in verses 5 and 6 where it really switches to praising God. So these sections seem to be setting the stage for us and how we can model particularly our prayer in difficult times. So we'll go ahead and start in verse 1. David wastes no breath and dives right into being honest with God and asking the questions that are on his heart. How long, O Lord? He's coming to God aware of where he's at. He's not trying to hide it. He's not trying to cover it up. He's not trying to pretend that he's okay. He just owns it. And he's basically saying, God, can't you see that I'm over here suffering? Don't you notice? Aren't you aware? And he basically asks 4 different questions, but he starts with the same lament that's really true of where his heart is broken and what his burden is, which is, how long will I feel forgotten? And that's really his first question. David is using these questions to express that he's feeling abandoned and that God is absent from his life. He desires things to be different. He doesn't want to stay here. So when David starts by saying, will you forget me forever? He goes a step further and he's admitting that he's feeling forgotten. David's describing the feelings that are overwhelming him. And yet, just prior to that, he says, how long, O Lord? David knows, and we know theologically, that God, since he is God, doesn't forget anything. And yet there are times when our feelings will overwhelm us. God knows everyone and everything, and nothing slips from his mind. But for David in this moment, he doesn't feel that to be true. He feels forgotten, and he's telling God how he's feeling. But then David turns a corner and moves to the next question. How long will you hide your face from me? And it's not just merely forgetting, like, oh, I forgot to check in on you, or you're right, I didn't text you today. Like, that's kind of the first sense. Like, did you forget me, Lord? But this is intentionality. How long are you going to hide from me? I'm seeking you and I cannot find you. Where are you? It really becomes more accusatory. Where David initially in his first question is leaving some room for God, like, hey, maybe you just forgot to check your calendar. I'm sure I'm on there somewhere. Now David is saying, I'm trying to find you, and it seems like you're intentionally avoiding me. And when our concerns are pressing and overwhelming, we can feel that way with God. We can feel like we can't find him when we need him. One of my kids was in one of those early years of learning how to get dressed. That awkward stage where they put the wrong arm in the wrong shirt hole and that stage. Well, one of them had gotten dressed, and they'll remain nameless, but it was twisted inside out in the wrong way, so they got it on, and is that kind of like stuck behind, and they couldn't really get it undone. And I could hear them getting more and more frustrated, and I was sitting in the living room, and they were back in their room getting dressed, and it went from frustrated to concerned. And so being a good dad, I wanted to give them space to work it out on their own, figure it out. And I didn't help them immediately, but in that moment of giving them a little bit of time to figure it out on their own, it went from frustrated to concerned to straight escalation to full screaming panic mode. And they started yelling, "Dad, where are you? I'm dying!" And in that moment, right, their life experience, they're figuring it out for the very first time. They don't know how to do it. And they know nothing else other than, I'm stuck, I'm trapped, I need help. But sitting in the living room, I know they're not dying. And I know that I can come help them at any moment. So that's what I did. But just not exactly when they were anticipating it. They survived, and they probably won't remember to be able to tell the same tale, but I remember that one. So what's the point? As a dad, I have the knowledge that every child has to wrestle through learning which opening matches which appendage. It's a learning process. You got to go through it. Sometimes it's a struggle. But also remember that they don't know that yet. And there's that balance. I can't do it for them, but I'm going to be there to guide them through it. They're experiencing life for the first time, and first-time life things are scary. But for those of us who are no longer children, does it really change as we get older? Some things are easier because we've experienced them before. But when we hit that, I've never lived through this, we stand up a little taller and our eyes get a little bigger and we start grabbing things a little bit tighter. So I would submit to you that we still can run into things that will scare us, that we'll be frightened of, where we will feel we don't have the answer. David, an adult, a shepherd who took on lions and bears, who fought Goliath, who was the king of Israel, he feels like he's talking to God and God's not paying attention. It seems like he's a little scared. He feels like God might be reading the paper or checking his phone when he has something so important. It's a looming problem in David's life, and so he laments, "How long, God, are you going to hide from me? Can't you see I'm stuck?" But I want to go back up into the first verse. And just prior to that, there's a title for the psalm. David wrote this, and he wrote it to the choir master. David is taking his feelings, and he's letting them be made known to the congregation. How good are we at doing that? Are we good at sharing our feelings? David was striving to do that. So much so he's like, hey, I'm even going to put this out in public. So everybody knows that the king of this nation gets scared sometimes, and he turns to God. I think that's important to know. I know particularly for men in our culture, it's got to all be on the inside. David didn't do that. You think of a manlier man in the Bible than David? There aren't really a lot more, I don't think, right? I mean, he did the whole spiel, the whole shebang. Lived in the woods, fought off wild animals, killed giants, slayed thousands of people in battle, became the king. And he's saying, I struggle too. He's letting people know that asking God honest questions from your heart is okay. He's letting people know it's okay to have feelings and express them. It's okay to feel scared sometimes. And it's okay to let God specifically know what's going on in your heart. That's just verse 1. Verse 2. David switches the focus of his feelings from the sense of God being absent to his struggle with feeling isolated. So he's really talking to God. God, I can't find you. I feel like you're not there. But now it shifts and it's more internal, like, I feel alone. And he says, how long must I counsel in my soul? I'm the only one I feel that I can turn to. David is wrestling with feeling alone. He's talking to himself. He's sorting through his own thoughts. He's internalizing his feel. He's talking about the sorrow that's in his heart day after day. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. People get stuck here because they start to spiral in that place. And they just keep it all inside. There's no check. There's no boundary. And it becomes a black hole. He feels that nobody cares. And he's starting to look down rather than looking up to God. But he still has other feelings, and so he expresses his final one in verse 2. How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? David's enemies are exploiting his situation. And David is feeling powerless to stop them. And he's turning to the one resource that has infinite power and knowledge, and he feels like God's not reaching back. So however long this took, in all this, David has finally gotten to the point where he can be honest with God and himself. He's lamenting the absence of God's presence and trying to express his isolation. But you know what's still in this verse? Even with 4 questions of how long, O Lord, it's that he's saying, Lord, there is still faith. He is starting from a point and a place where faith still exists and resides with him. He has not lost that. David is clinging to God in faith in spite of everything he's experiencing and feeling. So it's not just how long, but How long, O Lord? And that transitions right into verses 3 and 4, because he starts with, consider and answer me, O Lord, my God. He wants help. He needs help, and so he's specifically asking for it. But that next phrase, which is in the middle of this chapter, this short chapter, it reads, light up my eyes. And this is really the hinge point. He's getting all of his feelings, his suffocation in darkness. He's expressing that to God, to let God carry that burden for him. And he gets to the bottom of all that. And when he gets there, he's turning and saying, Lord, it is dark and I cannot see the light. I need your help. And that's why this sermon is entitled, Enlighten My Eyes. Because that's where we need to get to. But it means we need to struggle through all of those feelings and all of those difficulties to get to the point where we set aside our own ability and turn to God and admit our inability. I actually prefer the King James rendering because it reads, Enlighten my eyes. And there's another biblical story that has the same kind of idea. And that's 1 Samuel 14:29. I'm sure you all have that memorized, but it's when Jonathan, they've been fighting the Philistines all day. They go through a grove of trees, and Jonathan comes upon wild honey. And it says that he reaches out his staff, and he tasted it. And it says his eyes were made alive. He had renewed strength. And that's the idea here, is that it's something that I cannot do myself. Lord, I need help. I need you to step in and provide me with something. David is centering himself on the fact that he is missing something, but he knows God has the sustaining power to get him through, and he's appealing to that. You know, we're at the center of the psalm, and when we're in the center of everything, our own trials and troubles in life, and it starts to strip everything else away, it's God that we have to turn to, that we have to cling to, that we have to hold to. And he's expressing his need for God to help him see rightly so that his feelings are not overwhelming him and keeping him from seeing clearly. And this is where faith, again, he has enough faith to cling to God, to have presence of mind, to know that he's not where he needs to be. And he's not sure how to get there. But he's willing to reach out for help. And that really clarifies how we should understand verses 1 and 2. We have to go through that struggle. We have to get to the point where we can admit where we are. And we have to be able to turn for help. Turn to God first. But David, he's giving this to the congregation so that as the body of believers, that we would also be aware of what is going on. To be a physical resource, an in-person resource that can be turned to for help. He's being humble enough to admit that he is stuck, but he knows that God can help change that. Charles Spurgeon commented on David's prayer here, and he said, "Let the eye of my faith be clear so that I may see God in the dark." David's still in the dark, but he's asking for God to give him the light. The question of how long from verses 1 and 2 are still ringing in his ears, but God has not forgotten and turned away. David knows deep down that God is still there and there is hope, and he is reaching to God for the work that God will do. David is starting to move past his feelings. He's starting to rest again in his faith. He's saying, God, I feel like you're absent, but I know you are present. Help me. Give me understanding that I don't have. Enlighten my eyes to see, because all I can see is darkness. Then he goes on, and there's more at stake. And he goes on to list some of his specific concerns. He says, lest I sleep the sleep of death. He doesn't want to get overwhelmed to the point that death seems like it's the option, or that he gets painted into a corner where there's nothing else that he can think about. He says, lest my enemies say, I have prevailed, or lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. He has opposition. We might not have enemies with spears and swords sitting down the road. But there's plenty of enemies that face us, that cause us to think differently, or to hesitate, or to reconsider. David still feels like he doesn't have the ability to do what he needs to do. He can't see the end of the story yet. He only sees the problems, but he still wants God to know. And that's when David turns the next corner in verses 5 and 6. And the best word in the Bible, but. David is pouring out his heart, his feelings, his burdens. He's feeling like he's hitting rock bottom. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. But my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. But I will sing to the Lord in spite of all of this. David has just spent 4 verses lamenting God's absence and asking for him to intercede. And it seems like all of a sudden we're turning to praise and worship. And David does this all in just 6 verses. This only makes sense when we take a step back and we realize that this is the direction that David was traveling the whole time. Because faith is what David is grounded on. In his trouble, in faith, I'm letting you know how I'm feeling. In faith, I feel like I've hit rock bottom. I need you, Lord. And in faith, even though my circumstances do not feel like I should be doing this, I know I have trusted in your steadfast love, and that is the only thing I can be clinging to right now. He sets his feelings aside. He exposes them to truth and reality. And he goes back to looking at who God is and what God has done. He's grounding himself. He's throwing out his anchor. He's making himself secure in the immovable thing, which is God. And all 3 of these verbs here, have trusted, shall rejoice, will sing, they're all in the same tense. They're all carrying the idea that something has happened, and it is still true today, and it will still be true tomorrow. And so it really should be translated, I have trusted, and I will continue to trust in your steadfast love. I have rejoiced, and I will continue to rejoice in your salvation. I have sung, and I will continue to sing to you, Lord. I know I was able to do it in the past. I'm struggling to do that right now. But I know I'll get there and I'll be doing it again. You know, the first thing David references is God's love. It's his hesed love. Translated here, his steadfast love, as the ESV renders it. It's his love of covenant. It's the holistic love that brings stability and security, knowing that it will never fail. If we go back to 1 Samuel 16 and 2 Samuel chapter 7, it's when God chose David to be king, when God was with him with Goliath, when God was there and promised that David would have a kingdom and a throne forever. God's covenantal love with David. David is clinging to that. I have seen what you have done in my past, Lord. I feel like you're missing right now. But that's the only thing I can cling to. Can't you just imagine David recounting the promises as he's offering up this prayer, even though he doesn't know the end of this part of his story? God, I know you were there. I know you were there. I don't feel like you're here yet. But then the very last phrase, it's the why. Why is David doing all this? Because he has dealt bountifully with me. The psalm does not end where it began. It's not in lament. David is taking his feelings from being overwhelmed to placing them on the trust of what God has done in his life. It concludes in praise. It's reflecting on what is true. He is seeking to reset his perspective so that he can truly say, the Lord has been good to me. The phrase basically means exactly that. It's a transactional language. God has been dealing with David. God has been good to David over and over and over again. And we don't know exactly where in his life he is writing this psalm. But the steadfast love of the Lord is the greatest goodness of a deal that anyone would ever get. And it's available to every single one of us. It was true for David. And we have the same God and the same love that's available to us today. David considers God's goodness to be bountiful, to be abundant, to be overwhelming. And we can look back over the past thousands of years since the time of Adam and Abraham and Moses and David and Christ. God has been dealing goodness bountifully to his people throughout all ages. And what greater goodness than even just this past weekend, thinking on Easter that Jesus bled and died and rose again for us. What a bountiful goodness that we can live in light of with the resurrection of Christ. Paul wrote of it in Romans chapter 8, verse 32, when he said, "He who would not spare his own Son, What love? But gave him up for us all. What love? How will he not also graciously give us all things? In just 6 short verses, we get a glimpse of a model of prayer. It shows us 3 distinct movements. There's a questioning in verses 1 and 2. There's a requesting in verses 3 and 4. There's praising in verses 5 and 6. Another way to think of these 3 sections would be that as we face challenges to our faith, we need to admit that we need support when we're struggling. We need to seek and ask God to enlighten our eyes when we are in the dark. But we also need to take and anchor our faith deeply in what we know to be true about God in His covenantal, steadfast love. And we can pray that way, just like David did. And it seems like this is a prayer to God, and yet He's giving it to the congregation to be a song, to be sung, to be reflected on, to be brought before God. David was writing from his own heart. He put it publicly as a model for others to follow and engage with God in the midst of whatever circumstances and trials we might be facing. You know, I don't know what you might be going through this week or this month or this year or what lies ahead. But no other pillars of the faith like David struggled too. But they led the way that we can't lose our faith, but we have to cling to it all the more. So hopefully this has been a challenge and encouragement to you today. And whatever situation it may find you, I pray that God would enlighten your eyes through it. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly